Hi, everyone. Welcome to Bridges of the Soul, episode 2. I'm Melanie Urbar, and this is Tom Eckert. And today we're going to be discussing the topic of mental health on the spiritual path. Now, I know this topic is a little bit tricky for some people, or for a lot of us, and I think it can be a little bit polemic, but I think it's an important one to address. And so we wanted to dedicate the second episode specifically to people who are dealing with mental health issues and disorders, maybe such as bipolar disease, depression, or anxiety. Anxiety, and that are specifically not only exclusively, but specifically also medicated, or taking medication for these disorders. So I think the reason I want to dive into this is just because it can be really challenging to come up against a lot of suffering and realizing that you have certain limitations regarding your abilities to keep that suffering in check, or somehow maybe have more control over your mind. And because of that, I think a lot of additional guilt and shaming around this topic of mental health is very, very active. And I think, it's good for us to dive into these topics. Before we start, I just want to make very clear that neither Tom nor myself are medical professionals of any kind or therapists. This conversation is mainly based on our personal experiences with mental health and the experiences and teachings and amalgamation of situations that we've witnessed along the line of different people struggling with their mental health, and kind of how we can go about this from a very much more spiritual approach and not a scientific one. So that being said, Tom, welcome again. Glad to have you here as always.
Yeah, love to be here. Love to be here with you specifically. Love you to talk about this amazing subject.
Yeah, so why don't you introduce us a little bit? What has been your experience with mental health, maybe to situate our audience a little bit? How did you experience it as a spiritual guide, as a teacher, and as a person living in a first world country, in a modernized world, in a rational world, in a scientific medical world? What was your experience? And what kind of conclusions have you been able to draw over the course of time?
I think the best place to start is simply be transparent and honest and open about my own life, because that's, I think, the best connection point with our audience and with people, in large. My life since I've been a teenager, to date, I'm 37 years old, and from the age of 16, I believe, I've been suffering from severe anxiety and episodes of disintegration and crises that kept coming. And I know what it is to use antidepressants for anxiety, right? Anti-anxiety meds. And I know what it is to do that and to experience all of that being and treading on a spiritual path. So I think it's just important. I want to just position us in kind of a little bit my inner world, in my inner life, which is someone who actually knows it very closely, having been brought up in a family with a very severe, Holocaust background, having that kind of ancestral influence working inside of me. It's something that is, you can't run away from. Mm-hmm. So I want to start with that, and maybe I'll start with touching upon the fact that many of us, we start the spiritual path with a kind of ideal or the hope that we will be able to eradicate our suffering completely. Like we will be able to come to a point where we do not experience negative emotions whatsoever. And this kind of ideal and image is fortified and encouraged and supported by many kind of epic stories of spiritual awakenings and spiritual stories, especially coming from the East, but not only. All kinds of like, again, stories of role model teachers, some of them, most of them dead, that have reached some supposedly perfected state of constant bliss, of supreme happiness, where there's like a flawless state of being, where there's just, it's just absolutely immaculate. So we kind of come into the path with this image, most of us. And then we bump into a somewhat different reality, which puts us in a pretty difficult conundrum, because we find ourselves on a path and we deepen our meditation and we practice the teachings, whatever it is, our path, whatever our path is. And we realize that, yes, we are deepening, and yes, we are experiencing subtler, dimensions of wholeness, of joy, of stillness, of love, of compassion. We become more aware, but that doesn't cancel the fact that we do experience difficult states. And that is even more relevant and real for people who suffer from conditions like myself, right? And many, many other people I've met on the path, students, friends, and teachers alike. So for people who already have a predisposition for some kind of psychological, I don't want to give it like a negative connotation, so I'm trying to find like the right word, but like some psychological difficulties, right? It's this kind of ideal that has been like placed upon kind of like, or imposed on spirituality, creates much more of a conflict, an inner split, a divide. And unfortunately, there are some teachers that haven't gone through deep enough suffering in their lives, unfortunately, only from the perspective of the student who comes and did experience a lot of suffering, because these teachers often don't understand what it means. And often they will also live by that ideal. So they will look at you and they will see your suffering and they will say, something has to be wrong here. Something is not working. The practice is not deep enough. They don't really mean it. They're too identified, and all kinds of, you know what I mean? Without really understanding where that person is coming from, and the varying degrees of suffering that people have to deal with. Some of them that, some of which are so, deeply rooted in our DNA, that it's for the most part, like uncontrolled.
I would like to put a little pin in what you said about also this thing about being the student being too identified with the self, with the created self, and or with the ego narrative, or however you want to call it. I think that this is something that troubles a lot of students, especially a lot of people who are fairly at the beginning of their path. Let's say maybe, I mean, you can never really quantify in time how far along someone comes in a spiritual practice based on the time they've been practicing, because obviously
Not really, no.
it's just not possible. Like it's such an individual journey that you can't compare. So I won't go to that measure. So I won't measure it by time, but I think everybody can imagine what it means to be fairly in the beginning, where you've discovered some things, you've been practicing for a little while. You have a regularity in your practice, you're consistent, you maybe don't only have a meditation practice, you also complement it with a physical practice of some sort. So maybe it's yoga, it's maybe qigong or tai chi, or a martial art, running, swimming, anything like that. And perhaps you also have other complementary aspects to your spiritual practice that have to do with something like journaling or whatever it is, pick your choosings, I guess, here. So I think in the case of the student is trying so hard to silence the mind, to distance themselves from suffering, to relieve themselves from suffering. They're trying so hard to disidentify with this narrative of who they are. And I think what's really valuable to point out here, that teachers really, if they're not aware of the fact that their student is suffering from mental health issues, or what those issues even are, it can put so much more pressure on the student in this realm of the I'm not good enough.
Absolutely.
I'm not even good enough to keep up a spiritual practice that requires for me to do nothing but sit still. And I can't even do that. And that, if anything, if you are already suffering from mental health issues, a lot of them, we obviously here are, just to clarify again, we are going to be speaking obviously in very general terms. And then I'm going to please ask you guys to fill us in and to share what are your experiences here, because I think it's so valuable and so important. But
Absolutely.
so if you're going to be in a lot of mental illnesses have this root in this place of not being worthy, not being good enough. There's this narrative there that is really threatening somehow to any development that comes from within. And if you're trying this hard and you're trying to be so consistent with everything, and you know that you have like your mountain peak is twice as high as everybody else's perhaps, and you're still going at it, and your teacher responds with there's something wrong with you, or well, there's something wrong with the practice, I think if anything that can send you off the deep end in whatever pathology you might be having, and create a world of increased internal struggle instead of maybe helping you alleviate the struggles you already have. So perhaps my question here, Tom, is you as a teacher, how do you feel that this can be approached from this teacher-student relationship? How do you personally perhaps approach this? And in maybe a more general term, how do you think other teachers can begin to create, I mean, I would like to call it a trauma-informed way of teaching, but I think in this case, it's like a mental health informed way of teaching. Like how can this be integrated into the practice?
Let me see where to start. I think I think that the basis should be that we all, we have to understand that everyone can grow spiritually. Everyone. And that's the foundation. There's absolutely no one excluded. The moment we start kind of making a list of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, and what's allowed and what's not, and what can be and what cannot be on the path, we are living in some kind of divisive world. And this is not the truth of the path. Our life is the path. Our life is the path. And so everyone has the birthright and the birth ability and capacity to wake up, to grow, to expand spiritually. And they have that ability and capacity, and the door is open for them, whether they're in a war zone, or whether they are paralyzed, or have diabetes, or bipolar disorder, or anxiety disorder, or depression. Everyone has, the door is open for everyone. So first of all, we want to have that as a foundation, especially, again, you're asking me as a teacher, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm also a student, right? We're all students and teachers in a sense, but right, I'm kind of like functioning for a while as also a teacher. So you're asking me from that perspective. And so I'm telling you, look, everyone who's interested in growing up spiritually, the door is open. The door is absolutely open. And based on that, we start to use our life circumstances as our teachers. So for me, if a person, and I'm not expecting or asking of anyone to, to burden themselves with more suffering than they already have, like to feel as if because we're talking here about suffering that they should suffer. That's again another kind of like extreme or like some kind of trip. No, we all come with our unique baggage, or each one of us has a cross to carry. That's just simply part of life. And if I simply have to be aware of my own package and in its totality, and my package is my teacher, my life, my relationships, my suffering, my emotions, my thoughts, my strengths, my relationships, everything. So to me, it's like, what do I care? If you're taking medication or not, if you're depressive or not, if you're just like the happiest person on earth or not, as long as you're interested in growing up spiritually and opening to your true nature, as long as that there's that purity of heart that actually doesn't even start or stem from the individual self. It's not really the individual who decides to embark on this journey. And that's a deep truth on the path. Reality, that depth of light, we can say, whatever we want to call that, it wants to awaken through bodies. So when that kind of like, when for whatever mysterious reason, that kind of like the sun of truth, sun, S-U-N, right? The sun of truth wants to kind of like burst through an individual, it's not in anybody's control. And sometimes it's going to choose to do that through an individual who has experienced bipolar disorder or severe, mental states. You can check, for example, Byron Katie. Have you ever heard about Byron Katie?
Yeah.
Have been institutionalized, has suffered from like severe, psychological disorder, and, transformed. What do we know? Eckhart Tolle suffered from severe anxiety.
Yeah.
So we can see even famous figures, but we don't have, it's like we don't even have to use, them. It's like we don't need to have justification, right? It's like, come as you are, and let's work with what we have here.
Yeah, I really like what you said about the life circumstances being the greatest teachers.
Can you just repeat what you just said? Because I
I'd
think
like
it
to
got
kind
cut
of
off. I think it got a little bit choppy. Yeah.
that life circumstances being your greatest teacher.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that that's a very valuable anchor point for somebody who is struggling with their mental health, to kind of see it as, okay, well, there is valuable information here in this suffering. There is valuable information about maybe the roots of who you are, especially as we mentioned, if your condition or the issues that you struggle with, if they're not only of a personal, independent nature, but perhaps they're generational. Perhaps they really are kind of genetically carried on within your family, or even ancestral. Like there might be a whole lineage of people
Absolutely.
behind you
Mm-hmm.
that have come before you and that are bringing about these thoughts or anguishes that you're experiencing, and they can be a source of information for us to hone in on. So perhaps in this case, what do you think? How do you think is the best way for somebody who is struggling with their mental health? And I think sometimes you can have periods that are more stable than others. So if somebody's going through a particularly unstable period of time with themselves, what is something for them that they can keep in mind when sitting down for the practice, if they're up for even practicing, right?
Yes.
What is something that they can keep in mind that can, in their practice, that can perhaps take a little bit of this pressure off that I think a lot of us feel of, oh, I'm not doing this right. It's not working, as if something needs to happen, kind of, or losing your suffering or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that the most important thing is to have the most tender heart towards ourselves, to have a heart of compassion, of tenderness, and to remember that we don't need to be anybody. We don't need to become anybody. We don't need to be someone. We don't need to reach somewhere. We don't need to be better. We don't need to reach some kind of imagined state. The invitation is to embrace yourself, just like a mom would embrace her child, so lovingly, so intimately, so unconditionally. And again, when I say unconditionally, the ambitious amongst us, me included, because I am an ambitious guy and I had to work with this a lot, would interpret that as unconditionally, kind of like as again, like this, no, unconditionally means like in your total imperfection and inability to sometimes accept, you accept that. In your inability to meditate, you accept that. So ever so softly, ever so gently, ever so compassionately. And that's in many ways, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And you don't discriminate. You don't discriminate any experience. Because, for example, if you feel joyful, then you embrace that as well. And the point is, you embrace, ever so gently and lovingly, with loving arms and a loving heart. And simultaneously, when you hug your child or you hold your baby, you don't squash it, right? Otherwise, you can kill it. You can choke it. It can suffocate. So it's the same with your states. When you're suffering, when you're experiencing intense psychological states, be there for them, but don't strangle them. You know what I mean? And that is like just gently hug them. And then it's like in their own time, they will come and they will go. Now it's going to be very uncomfortable. So we must be realistic. The spiritual path is not about living in some kind of abstraction, but it's being very real. So if we're searching only for comfort, then we are looking in the wrong direction, because the spiritual path is about making us real. And real means that when you feel deep discomfort, there's no way you can run away from it. But it's going to feel much better if at least you create the surroundings, the ambience, the atmosphere within your being of love, of compassion, of embrace, because then that discomfort can be held within a space of sweetness and gentleness. And there's really something healing about that. And so it's allowed to flow and to simply, energy changes all the time, and it fluctuates and it will change. And so maybe after a while of doing that kind of tender holding without like strangling or holding too tight to the suffering, it changes. And then comes a kind of a stillness, a peace, a joy. But then we have to continue with that same honesty. We embrace it lightly, gently, like a mom, a mother embracing her smiling child, also without strangling it or right suffocating. So we don't hold too tightly, but we're there. We're really there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that might resonate with a lot of people. Personally, I can say that a large part of my path, especially in the year 2020 to 2021, in that transitional stage, I think a lot of my struggles and a lot of my spiritual path in general and the practices that I was holding, they were tailored to being able to reach this place of acceptance. And I actually think um, as this year has started and taken on, I've noticed that I've circled back around to having to do that and realizing that it's a continuous process. It's actually it's become such an integral part of my own practice, of my own meditation, to not even in my meditation alone, I think just in general, and the way that I try to go through life is realizing that there are certain parts of yourself that are really quite out of your control, um, which is this kind of ironic thing because one of the most one of the key things that you pick up on when you start a spiritual practice is the fact that most things are out of your control. And by you trying to control them, you just waste a lot of energy and a lot of time, and you create more suffering for yourself. You know, if you think about someone like Eckhart Tolle, that's kind of exactly what his statement is release the need to control anything about the future by witnessing the past, because it's just, you're not being present in that moment, and everything that is present is the only thing that you can control. And not even so, you can only control your witnessing of that which is happening. And so this element of witnessing yourself as you are, including all the parts of yourself that slip out of your control, that you might even need medication for, that's how far it slips out of your control. You just cannot, with any training, tame the certain parts of the animalistic self. We talked about that the last episode, the animalistic self and how it takes over. There's parts of that you might not be able to tame on your own, because of your biological composition. And so learning to embrace all of that with compassion and learning to not talk yourself down because of it is a entire journey in and of itself. Because sometimes we succeed and sometimes we don't.